In previous videos, I've talked about shutter speed and aperture, ISO, white balance, and so many other things. Today I want to show you how to take all these and put them into play in one time so that you have complete control from top to bottom, left to right, every aspect of your photograph. Now please keep in mind that I am recording this in video, so there's only so much I can do as far as showing you shutter speed differences. However, I'm going to do my best right now. I am right now at 125th of a second at f1.8. What you'll see is that the image is very washed out. The house there, the playhouse, is completely blown out. You can barely tell what is what. So what I'm going to do is speed up the shutter. And in that, you're actually going to see the house become clearer. The clicking you hear is actually me turning the dial to adjust the shutter speed. Right now you can see that the playhouse is properly exposed and it has very shallow depth of field. That's because the aperture is set to 1.8. As I close up the aperture to, let's say, f4 to f8, you actually need to adjust either by raising the ISO or by slowing the shutter speed down in order to compensate for letting less light through the lens through the aperture. So watch what happens when I make the aperture f8. So right now the aperture is f8, I'm at shutter speed 1/1000th, and you can barely see anything. So I'm going to have to slow the shutter speed down again. And right now we are at a 60th of a second, and that's pretty good. But let's say I need it to be faster than a 60th of a second. Let's say I need it to be 1/200th of a second. And I go back to 1/200th, which is right here, and it's a little bit too dark. But my ISO is at 64. So if my shutter speed is at 1/200th of a second, where I want it to be, and my aperture is at f8, where I want it to be, the only thing left to do is to bump up my ISO, the sensitivity of the sensor. So I'm going to bump up the ISO from 64 to about 200, which is where I am happy with right now. So right now, my settings, again, are 200th of a second, f8, and ISO 200. Let's say you get your settings for shutter speed or aperture and your ISO in place. The next thing to do is to get your white balance in place. So right now my white balance is actually set for sunlight. Let's say this was a cloudy, overcast day. I would switch it to cloudy, and now my white balance is set for that. Let's say I was indoors and I was under fluorescent light. I would go over to fluorescent, and now I'm set to fluorescent. Of course, I am actually outside, so the colors are gonna look very weird. But let's say I was actually in tungsten light, I would go to that white balance. Or if I wanna go back to, let's say, shade, I can go to shade. Or of course, I can go back to sunlight if I'm out in the sun, which I currently am. So with that, I now have every aspect of the camera set for that condition. I have it set for the shutter speed I want, for the aperture I want, for the ISO I want, and for the white balance that I want. Now, if I wanted motion blur in the photo, of course I would have to make that shutter speed longer, like a 30th of a second or a 20th of a second, something like that. When I'm recording a video, it actually won't let me go slower than a 60th of a second. So what I'm going to do is actually switch to a photo, and I'm going to capture a couple photos with me walking in front of the camera at 200th of a second versus me walking in front of the camera at a 20th of a second. So what you should have noticed there is different types of movement based on the shutter speed that we had. Now we're going to go over aperture. As you can see here, right now I'm at 1.8 aperture. Everything behind me is pretty blurred, very shallow depth of field. But as we close up and go to a larger number f-stop, you're going to see that more of the background is in focus and the depth of field isn't so shallow anymore. Right now I'm at f9 for my aperture, and you can see again the background is less blurred. It's still blurred because it's focused on me, but it's less blurred than it was before. So as you can see, manual photography is all about adjusting. It's about adjusting for what you need, whether it's still movement, motion, background blur or no background blur, brighter, darker, all that stuff comes into play. You have to figure out what you want and then adjust from there. Whenever you make an adjustment on one thing, something else has to be adjusted to counteract. Think about that next time you put your camera into manual mode. Typically, I recommend starting with figuring out what aperture you want. Depending on the situation, if you're doing sports, maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you want to start with figuring out what shutter speed you want and then worrying about the aperture after. If you like this video, click that subscribe button below right now. I publish new videos every Monday and Thursday, whenever possible. You don't want to miss it. And be sure to check out my entire series on learning photography as a beginner.